With only days to go before the Brexit deadline, our esteemed leaders have overseen a state of great confusion. Most parliamentarians are on the Remain side, so the act of steering the nation out has been mired in controversy, with both sides making convincing arguments. Presenter Mike Newland argues that Brexit in name only might not be the undesirable result that some expect.
Benjamin Franklin said that the problem with democracy is it's two wolves and a sheep, or a lamb, deciding on what to have for lunch. Well, actually he didn't say that, it's just attributed to him. Apparently it first comes from the Los Angeles paper in the 1990s. But what he did say, apparently, is that somebody asked him what sort of system of the American Revolution he's putting together in the later 18th century. And he said, we're giving you a republic if you can keep it. Now, there's a lot in that, isn't there? So you set up a nice governmental system, and then the politicians, as he well understood, will try and undermine it and corrupt it, so you don't get what you thought you were going to get. Now, the way they got the American revolutionaries paid far more attention to the rights that people should have than to democracy itself, because they recognised that unfettered democracy is it can become a monster, against the lamb, or whatever. And so they paid a great deal of attention to it. In fact, I understand they don't mention democracy once in the Declaration of Independence. They were more concerned about the protection of rights. Now you need a constitution. We don't have a written constitution in this country. And of course we've always been told we didn't need one because you could rely on the gentleman's club of politicians to uphold our great traditions. Good luck with that. God. I came across this quote from, I hope that's quoted correctly, he's an Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police. He said, my point about the far right threat is that the far right threat is a political rhetoric from people who think they've got a legitimate political point, right? So if you express a view, you've got a political point to make, and you make it, and it's classified as far right, you then become a threat, rather than simply citizens expressing their views. Boy, do we need a constitution in this country? This is a policeman, he's saying, stand here and say this, you're straightway regarded as a legal threat in some way. But all you're doing is expressing an opinion. We really need a constitution here. Now, extending what Benjamin Franklin didn't say, for the last 40 years, we've actually had a system with not two wolves and a lamb, but we've had a lot of lambs and a very few wolves, and the lambs have been voting to grant the wolves their lunch. That's what we've been doing, isn't it? We're putting ourselves up for the wolves' lunch. Yeah. Now that raises another difficulty with democracy, that you can persuade people to vote against their own interests, and of course the system's extremely good at doing that. Now I came across the Russians have got a concept called spiritual security. Now, of course, everybody knows that it's all endlessly repeated, the first duty of the state is the security of its citizens, which means, you protect them from being blown up and things like that. But actually, there's another side to this. You could have a state where you have excellent defence and nobody attacks you from outside, but you're destroyed internally by your own politics. Yeah, so what about some protection against that? And that's what the Russians mean by spiritual security. The idea that you are secure in your way of life, and politicians and schemers can't take it away from you. Well, we don't have that protection in this country, do we? We don't even have the physical defence protection much anymore, but even less do we have spiritual security. I mean, well, I'll come to the question of population replacement later because it's so important. If you replace, you can't have any spiritual security in your own community, in your own way of life, if you can see that your population is being gradually and deliberately and systematically replaced. Well, one later than the revolution, the American president said he didn't want the country turned into a polyglot boarding house. Well, that's pretty much what we're heading to here, isn't it? The polyglot boarding house, which of course suits those who look at things entirely in economic terms as a business park. This country is just a business park to make profits in, and if they're making profits, then it's a good thing and must be good for everybody, trickle down and so on. That's the way they look at it. But there's no spiritual security here. And no wonder we're all nervous. What we're heading for with the Brexit, what we're heading for is BRINO by Chino. You come across these terms? BRINO is Brexit in name only, and Chino is Conservative in name only. So we're heading for Brexit in name only, driven by politicians who are Conservative in name only. In fact, Delingpole said he asked her, he was on some TV programme on the BBC, and he asked some Tory MP, it's a very long time since your party did anything Conservative. Yeah, well, of course it is, because they're not Conservative at all. It's a farcical to call themselves Conservatives anymore. That's gone. No wonder they don't have many members anymore. Now, if you ask the politicians in the House of Commons, how do you justify going against the vote, which they themselves voted for, the plebiscite on Brexit? They themselves invited that vote. They held it. It wasn't forced on them, and they told us that our decision would be respected. If you ask them, how can you not respect the decision, assuming they were even willing to admit it, of course, they would say, they'd probably start talking about Edmund Burke and his famous address to the electors in Bristol in 1773, where he said that the elected politicians are not delegates, they're representatives. They're not sent along to express the voters' direct views. Like the voters say, go along there and tell them to say this or that or the other. They're representatives. Their job is to use their own wits and wisdom to forward what they think is good for the country. Yeah? Well, that sounds okay, but as the ever-acute David Starkey said a couple of weeks ago, when Edmund Burke was an MP, there were only a few thousand voters in Bristol. Hardly anybody got the vote. So you could pretty well argue, if you just do what the few voters tell you, it's pretty unreasonable. But that's not the same now when we have mass suffrage. Well, since not that long, actually. We haven't had mass suffrage it's only since the late 1920s everybody's got the vote. It's a remarkably short length of time. So maybe we shouldn't be too secure in the idea we can have a vote for much longer. But it's not reasonable when you have a mass suffrage and when you have also you have a referendum on leaving the EU, that any politician should pull the Edmund Burke card. And of course that's what they'll do. Now, of course, another trick they use is the wolf in sheep's clothing, which Macron, they played that in the Macron, didn't they? Macron is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was put up, how you can mislead in a democracy, he was put up as some kind of independent outsider the system. Of course, he was right in the system. He was part of the system, just people hadn't heard of him. He was a mainstream person who was put up and sold to the French as some kind of outsider when he was nothing of the kind, as they had belatedly realised. And they were too timid to vote for Le Pen, so they voted for another insider. Well, you can play that trick so many times, you can't play it forever. If all fails, play the Edmund Burke card. Now, of course, also in a democracy, you can get the lambs to vote for the wolves' dinner by manipulating with the media. And, of course, the media is very good at that, or it has been in the past. It now has competition. So I thought, well, if you want to know how bad the media's got, just look at what Sarah Sanders has to put up with at the White House press conferences. Have you watched that? Yeah. She's the press representative, yeah? She does the press conferences at White House. I mean, the garbage that poor woman has to put up with from these people. They call themselves journalists. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at, for a moment, at a paper from the past and just compare with the sort of papers we've got now. Because in the past, there were these great press barons, and they had a lot of power, and they had a virtual monopoly on communications. So you might think, well, they wouldn't do a very good job on informing you. Well, just an example, just by educational purposes. This is the... I'm not going to hand this round, it's quite fragile. This is the News Chronicle for early in May 1937. Yep. Look at the size of it. There's 20 pages like that in this paper. News Chronicle, not a terribly highbrow newspaper. There's about 25 stories on the front page, and only about 3 of them are about celebs or sport. It's all serious stuff. And it goes on, the paper goes on like that. You learn far more about what was going on May the 3rd, 1937 from this paper than you would learn about what was going on today from the Daily Mail. which is pretty comparable. Lead story, the Spanish Civil War, yeah? But what really caught my eye was this story here. We all know, because of the propaganda, that in the 1930s, Chamberlain failed to rearm the country, didn't prepare the country for war. In the uncertain circumstances of the 1930s, it was very sensible to rearm. And of course, we all know, appeasement and so on, Chamberlain didn't do anything. Here is Chamberlain, Chancellor of the Exchequer, about 3 weeks before he became Prime Minister, and he's introduced a new tax on business, a defence tax to pay for defence. And the Tory MPs are all moaning about it. We don't want to pay, our businessmen don't want to pay any more taxes and so on. So it goes on down there, and Chamberlain offers some concessions. And 3 weeks later, Baldwin resigned and he became Prime Minister. So, the stories here are all, there's one sports story, there's also, in fact, you can relate to a lot of this stuff now. The King and Queen have just been to Greenwich to open the Maritime Museum. Went to a talk at the Maritime Museum recently, yeah. That's very relevant. And another little thing was, Stan Laurel's wife has asked the court to cancel her divorce because Stan has promised to treat her right in the future. So that's the only sort of celeb story on the front page. Now you look at it, half the stuff is about people you've never heard of, So-and-so shows off her endowment on the beach and so on. There's all those sort of stories, isn't it, yeah? Or fight outside nightclub by some other B-list celeb you've never even heard of. So, this paper, for all the power of the press barons to manipulate people, they did a damn sight better job on informing them with papers like this, even middlebrow ones like this, than our newspapers do today. Huge power, which was not exercised, which is now exercised in a far more unfavourable way to us than it was in the 1930s. Now, the biggest manipulation, of course, is the press has undertaken in the last few decades is about immigration. Well, it's called immigration, but it's not. It's population replacement. And if there's one single thing we could do as nationalists, because people say, it's all right to make a speech about what's wrong, what are you going to do about it? Well, the most important message to get across here to people is this is not immigration, it's population replacement.
Absolutely.
You are being replaced. And that is beginning to creep more and more into social media and even into some of the mainstream media, just occasionally. That is a really important message to put across. Now, we're told that the great influx of people is helping us economically, and they argue about that, and then they say things like, well, we've done the figures, and it turns out they're paying slightly more tax than they take out in benefits. In the short run anyway, but let's assume that's true. Supposing the argument is, okay, well, we paid out £3 billion, but they paid in £3.5 billion, so therefore it's a benefit to the economy. The only economist I've heard mention anywhere, the fact that this is only half the story was John Mills. Heard of John Mills? Well, a few years ago he was Labour's biggest donor. He's also a Brexiteer, and he's an economist. And he pointed out, bit difficult to understand this, I'm going to explain it by a parable. If you add to the population, much of what we enjoy as prosperity doesn't come from our efforts. It comes from our efforts in tandem with the capital stock that's been built up, all the roads, the machines and so on. If you bring in more people and you've got the same capital, the capital spread is diluted among more people. Now, example of that, this is not Mill's example, this is mine, but I think it illustrates it. You're living in a fishing village with 100 people and you've got 5 fishing boats and all your food comes from fishing boats. There's one boat to every 20 people. Now the population doubles. You've now got 200 people. Let's suppose the extra 100 who come in are just as skilled as fishermen and just as hard working. What's the problem, they would say, in today's discussion. We're going, where's the problem? They're all just as hard working. But you've now got 200 people and there's still only 5 boats. Yeah? One boat for every half and half is twice as many people per boat. So unless the new people coming in can contribute the money to build up the capital stock, to the point where the amount of capital per person is the same as it was before, you're losing. The existing population is losing. And I did a quick calculation on this based on the Office of National Statistics. You can take it something like, per person in this country, the capital stock is £100,000, So that means every person coming in adding to the population needs to contribute £100,000, so that they then contributed their share of a capital stock, which remains at what it was before. John Mills is the only person who's ever mentioned this. This is the huge drawback with the idea that you just bring in people if they're hardworking and skilled. There's no problem. It ignores the capital stock. Now, Cromwell famously dismissed Parliament in the 1650s, and he told them that their job was to resolve grievances. And of course, they weren't doing it. They'd become the grievance. Yeah. Well, if we asked ourselves over the last 40 years, what is our biggest single grievance in this country? We'd have to say the politicians in Parliament, because they're behind everything that's gone wrong. Yeah. As I begin. So talk about history repeating itself. You know, we could go into Parliament and say, in fact, it has been quoted regularly in the press recently. They'd go there and use Cromwell's exact words, you know, about grievances that would go, we've had enough of you. Well, why did that come about? Well, part of the reason was, and this is something that really annoys me, it's the brigade who talk about, let's string them up. Yeah, you see that in social media all the time. Where these politicians, what they've done to us, we need to string a few of them up to warn them off. No, we don't. This is the worst thing you could do. Anyone who talks like that is the enemy of any change, because you frighten people off. You think, what would political change mean? You know, there's going to be a bloodbath here, like the French Revolution. No, if they lose power, the politicians lose the biggest thing that's most important to them. My treasure, where's my treasure, my power? They lose the biggest thing that's most important to them. You don't want to go any further than that. People who talk about revenge and so on are making a huge political mistake. And of course, the mistake was made in the English Civil War. Executing the king was a mistake. Created a martyr. Inevitably, something like that creates the feeling it's our turn now. Among the gentry who got into Parliament, it's our turn now. We're going to get our lot. You know, the others benefited from when they were in. We're going to. It doesn't encourage a healthy and constructive way of doing things. Now, one person who didn't make that mistake, the French Revolutionists made the same mistake, of course, and a horrible bloodbath. In fact, Danton and Robespierre were to guillotine themselves. You know, it wasn't too unjust, really. Yeah. Then there was a horrible reaction. It's all completely unnecessary. Yeah. It's creating trouble for themselves. Now, one person who didn't make this mistake of this let's string them up was Mandela. No, he didn't make that mistake. He said, no, we want this to be a calm and peaceful revolution to a rainbow society. He was quite right. And as a result, at the time that Mandela's revolution took place, the general view among the press, which they were only too anxious to project, was that the fact everything is so calm and there's so much goodwill means that the underlying project is sound. It wasn't. The underlying project was flawed because it made too great demands on human nature. And that's only beginning to become apparent. Yeah? The idea of all caring and sharing fairly, it wasn't going to happen in the long run. I mean, human nature just won't allow for that. But whether Mandela did what he did because he thought it was a good idea, or he cynically thought, well, later on, you know, this is the way to get the whites out, make out everything's going to be sweetness and light, and allay everybody's suspicions. Anyway, whatever reason, he approached it in the right way. And if anybody is tempted to...
ANC quartermaster terrorist.
If anybody is... sorry, what did he say?
He was a terrorist.
He was a terrorist.
He was a terrorist.
Yeah, well, of course he was a terrorist, but doesn't mean he made a mistake in everything he did. I'm not supporting... Mandela got in charge of a revolution, and he didn't make a core mistake made by so many revolutionists before of having a bloody bloodbath after it, yeah? That's plain, isn't that a plain fact? Yes? Yes? Wasn't that sensible of him? From his own point of view, one way or the other.
He didn't actually have a revolution, I believe.
Well, it was a revolution, of course it was.
It was more or less handed to him. F.W. de Klerk.
Of course, but that's
an election. The entire international community were involved in it. It wasn't as if the ANC rose up through the whites and said, look, we're better.
No, it wasn't, but it was a revolutionary change, and he was the figurehead.
He was probably worried about international funding.
It's all those sort of things, yes, I'm sure he was. But if anybody's tempted, I don't know why that guy's getting annoyed. I mean, I'm just stating facts about the best way to handle political change. And it's not to do...
Revolutions don't always happen with blood and people running on the street with pints.
What?
The Industrial Revolution didn't, nor did the Agricultural Revolution. So,
Later on. So if anybody's tempted to do this string 'em up stuff, it's a huge mistake. It throws the whole movement for change also into the hands of the police, so they can say, look at these people are like, they want to murder people the next minute, you know. It's absolutely silly and completely counterproductive to your own cause. If there is a fake departure, and it looks like there will be, then that fake departure will not be such a disaster. And let's just analyse it for a moment. Supposing the politicians deliver a genuine Brexit, what's going to happen? The people will go back to sleep. They'll say all these people who claimed it wasn't really a democracy, politicians didn't respect democracy, they were all wrong. You can trust these people, these parties. Let's carry on with the same existing party system. That's what people do. They go back to sleep. And the steam will go out of change. The people who promoted Brexit, who campaigned for it for years, inevitably, in the process of campaigning, they over-egged the pudding. As Adrian's pointed out, they made out that everything that was wrong in Britain was caused by the EU. It's not. And, I mean, a salient example is immigration. I mean, the fact is, do we have an immigration influx because of the EU and free movement? Even without anybody coming in from the EU, we'd still be having far more people coming in than the 100,000 the government claimed. Yep. And also, the Brexit vote it wasn't a vote to control immigration, it was a vote to have the right to control it, which is a very different matter. They can then say, the government can say, well, yeah, we now control immigration in Europe, we're going to let even more people in. Yeah? So, that's from our point of view the disadvantage of a genuine Brexit. In the long run, it could be very politically counterproductive. Let's look at it from the point of view of people in Europe. What are they going to say? They're going to say, well, we're not too happy with the EU, but you know, they've had a shot across the bows here, you know. But Britain has shown you can leave the EU. It's not Hotel California, where you can check out, you can't leave. It's not, you can leave, so we can leave any time, so we can relax a bit. The politicians have been warned, people, one country wasn't happy, maybe they'll reform. So people in the steam in Europe against the EU will probably die off a lot if we were to be given a genuine Brexit. On the other hand, if we give them a fake Brexit, and people do understand that, and I think they will now, then they're going to be have a continued animus against the government and the political system. And the people in Europe are going to say, my goodness, the EU is really worse than I thought. Even if you vote to leave, you don't. Yeah? The whole political class are in cahoots. So there are considerable longer-term political advantages in a fake Brexit. Of course, this is deeply disappointing to people who've gone out for years on the street and campaigned. They got the vote, and they thought it was now going to be delivered. Yeah, it's deeply disappointing. But you have to look at the bigger picture. You know, the bigger picture. The whole game of our survival does not depend on Brexit. It's a far bigger issue to do with what politicians we have. That's the root of the trouble. The political class in Europe. The EU is a small potatoes compared to that. So you have to think in a bigger picture with this kind of thing. So if we left, there are advantages in it, sure. We've left, you know, but if we don't leave, there are advantages in it too. That wouldn't have been true some years ago. If we'd had a fake Brexit some years ago, people would just said, oh, they're too powerful, nothing you can do, you know, we'll just have to give up. But in an atmosphere that we've got now with nationalist parties or populist parties growing all over Europe, that's not the case. So I don't think we need to worry too much about I'm fairly relaxed about whether we leave or we don't, because the whole business has stirred up everything in an amazing way. That the low point to me was early in 2017. Trump had been elected, and he looked like they were trying to drive him out of office. The chorus of abuse against Trump, and we'd had the Brexit vote, and everything went quiet. Nothing happened. Yeah, where's the declaration of Article 50 that Cameron promised the next day? It never arrived. So that was the low point. And then at that time, of course, inevitably, the mainstream opinion was that it was all people making a bit of a fuss because they were annoyed. and they'd soon get used to it and it all died down, you know. They've waved their pitchforks and they'll soon get bored and they won't want to wave them anymore. Well, that's not what happened, is it? A couple of years later, things have really moved on, and the pitchfork waving is still continuing, and it's going in scale and noisiness. There was a bit of a trap there, you know, there really was a bit of a trap in overselling Brexit. And one of the reasons this was done, why so many people campaigned for Brexit, is because it's one of the few things you could campaign for which involved change that didn't intrinsically involve being accused of the usual sort of things, you know. What else choice have you got? You know, you talk about immigration, and it gets a bit difficult, you know, but if you talk about just leaving the EU, it's a technicality to do with the way the parliamentary system's run and the law and so on. That was all right, you can do that. So a lot of people, timid people, preferred to concentrate on like UKIP. They preferred to fall into a bit of a trap of overselling Brexit. Now, migration numbers from elsewhere, the vote is only to gain control. It's not to actually exercise that control. And our core problem is that we're within the tentacles of a political class throughout Europe. In fact, even if we had a genuine Brexit, the politicians here would probably shadow the EU. They'll say you've left, but they'll do what the EU wants. So we're all still aligned with the EU in some way. Not by law, but by practice. That's what they'll do, you know. So lots of traps here. So leaving creates a huge complacency problem, and also the problem that the parties, the populist parties in Europe, they may diminish in their effectiveness because people will say the political class have had a shot across the bows. A fake exit generates an ongoing political force which has been growing for 2 years, and I think this won't stop. It also allows, if we're still in the EU in some way, it also allows us to join with groups in other countries in something like perhaps Salvini's 10-point plan for cross-country plan for European survival, what we need to keep our own societies in Europe. We can join with that. We're not outsiders anymore. We're still insiders. So I think that's all very good. I'm fairly relaxed about what's happening because so much is happening, and so much positive is happening, and the downturns and the efforts to thwart it are not going to succeed on this scale of revolt. We can't leave Europe and then save our own civilization on our own. We have to do it across the whole of Europe. It's European civilization that's threatened, not just us. So what will happen to Brexit? Well, I think the most likely outcome is that the EU will do its usual tricks, which is a last-minute apparent concessions, yeah? And in order to save the taxpayers' money, I've written the communique ready so the civil servants don't have to spend time on it. An exhausted May emerged triumphant from all-night negotiations, having battled and won the concessions that Britain needs. Yeah? Applause from the press. The entire editorials across the mainstream press will tell you, well, she came through for us, didn't she? She got the concessions. And the concessions will be just so much garbage, you know, pretend concessions. I mean, these people spend all day thinking up forms of words that appear to mean one thing and mean another. The concessions will be the same. There won't be any concessions. Yeah, they'll just make it look like it, and the editorials will crow, and May will be treated as a heroine, and we won't have left. That's the most likely outcome. Of course, they might just bungle it, and we might leave by accident. Yeah, by accident, by their own muddling around, you know, and duplicity, we might end up actually leaving. But I think that's less likely the plot working. You have to remember that May is not a first-rate politician. She's a second-rate careerist, and a far smarter way to handle this business would have been to arrange a genuine Brexit and then collude with the other European politicians so in practice we hadn't left, although we legally had. Yeah, that would have been far smarter, but she ain't that smart. I mean, May is just a person who, she drifted into high office by keeping her head down and not annoying people. Because it's said that in the Conservative Party, the secret of advancement is don't make trouble. Then you become a safe pair of hands and you get promoted. If you've made any trouble, you know, then they're much more reluctant to elect you leader. She avoided causing any trouble. During the campaign, she kept her head down. Nobody knew what she thought. Ideal person for a party like the Conservative Party, which is so conniving. So that's what I think will happen. The last-minute bogus concessions, it's the way they work. So what we'll have in the negotiations from now until March, a stage-managed war with people laughing behind their hands at the naivety of the public, while all these politicians play this game of pretending they're negotiating and having big fights at night and so on. I mean, they've done this for years, these all-night conferences and the communique and fighting for this and fighting for that. And they just laugh and the person goes off. Everybody's happy. The person goes back to their own country and they get the headlines and so on. They've been doing this game for years. This might have worked in the 5 years ago, but people are genuinely wising up on it now. So what we need to do, I mean, Adrian said, we and others have said that these sort of talks identify problems, they don't offer solutions. Well, the two big things we should be doing is plugging migration into this country as a replacement and not immigration. The word immigration should be dropped. It's a very, very misleading word in our circumstances. And the other thing we should do is talk about ourselves as Conservatives, because that's what we are. We're trying to conserve our way of life, aren't we here? Yeah, because this problem with nationalism is that there are two different types of nationalism. There's what's called technically in the literature integral nationalism, which means the type where you say we're good, we're going to march around and control everybody else. And then there's the other sort, which is known in the literature as risorgimento nationalism, after the Italian movement for unification in the 19th century, which is not about conquering anywhere else, it's about the right to self-determination, yeah? But immediately you mention nationalism, people immediately classify you as the integral kind. They would go about, well, they go about Hitler, obviously, that's the idea. Oh, you want jackboots, do you, marching to other countries? So better to keep away from the word nationalism and call it conservatism. If people press you, you can say, well, this is a conservative movement of the right to self-determination, because that's what we're really about, isn't it, here? Nothing to do with all these threats that policemen like to talk about. So that's what I think we should be doing.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to echo Mike's there on replacement. I work in North London, there's a college there. And believe me, at lunchtime when they'll come streaming out, there are no white kids, none at all now. You can't tell me that's immigration. I mean, that is replacement of the indigenous people in Newland. Exactly, mate. Yeah. Right, any questions for Mike at all?
Yeah. Our colleague keeps talking about us taking all this in a relaxed manner.
Yeah.
What about somebody like me who's angry all the time and I want to see these people and politicians hanging from street lampposts?
I knew you were going.
I'm not relaxed about it.
I know you do.
hate these politicians.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, but unfortunately...
So we should hate them. They've deliberately caused this country a lot of problems and caused me problems. I am not relaxed about it like you are.
I think, yeah, we got your point.
Yeah, we got your point.
I want you to remember that.
You've made your point.
I am angry at what they've done.
What did we say at these
take it
meetings?
in a relaxed manner, and that would be advisable.
What did we say? What did we say at these meetings?
Right, I'll make a point. I saw a brilliant example of this 50 years ago when the so-called Velvet Revolution took place in Czechoslovakia. There was a humble communist guy running Czechoslovakia called Mr. Dubček.
Yes.
He stood up for a nice, friendly communism. The people in the Kremlin took fright, and he was arrested and whisked off to Moscow, and Dubček thought that his end had come. And he disappeared for about 3 years, then suddenly Mr. Dubček turned up again, and he was seen standing at a tram stop with a little leather bag holding his sandwiches, and he had been given a job as a clerk in the local gasworks. And everybody at the tram stop, knowing who Mr. Dubček was, the former guy who'd been whisked off to the Kremlin and by a minor miracle hadn't been shot because the guys in the Kremlin had learnt a secret or two, here was Mr. Dubček waiting to go and do his clerical work at the gasworks, and everybody at the tram stop at 6 o'clock in the morning, because they get up early in Czechoslovakia, everybody thought, that's Dubček, and he was humiliated. Dubček was humiliated by standing at that bus stop with his little sandwich box. If he'd been shot, they'd be cheering his name now, but he looked a loser, and that showed the Kremlin knew how to operate.
Exactly.
Following up that comment of Richard's, following up that comment of Richard's, there's a very famous example from English history. Mike correctly pointed out that Parliament probably made a mistake by executing Charles I. Although they did it because he was always going to be a focus.
Yes, of course. That's the
great example
pretext,
a few years later when William III overthrew James II. He allowed James II to escape. And some of William's Dutch guards arrested James in Rochester and sent him a message saying, we've arrested the fugitive James Stewart, etc. When he said, no, you've got a case of mistaken identity, you've got the wrong man. He said, no, we've got the right man. No, you bloody idiot, you've got the wrong man. He did not want to execute his own father. He wanted him to escape and go and rant and rave in Paris and come take him over, which is in fact what happened to all the Stuart heirs. They all went abroad.
I mean, I'm glad I'm ruffling a few feathers. Because the fact is,
they pardoned nearly everyone who'd killed.
Yeah, they executed most of the registrars.
Yes, they did.
I'm glad I ruffled a few feathers, because you have to think about what you're doing, because it's not always sensible, is it? You can make huge mistakes and go on reinforcing them.
Whereas James, for example, after suppressing Monmouth's rebellion, carried out mass executions in the West Country, almost 300 in one day in Rochester, which was a small town. It was a big mistake. All the accused were guilty. They're all guilty of treason, all guilty of exactly which they've been convicted. But executing all these poor people who'd been taught by Monmouth into joining his army, all great cruelty, just made James detested. It was a terrible mistake. Yeah, the Jeffreys, yes.
It would be wonderful if we could get 1 or 2 MPs, let alone being in a position to execute anybody.
You're not going to get MPs by standing up there, going for election and saying, elect me because I want to string up these bastards who've done something for you. They won't vote for you.
No.
And they're right.
The first thing is to get into power.
Of course it is.
Absolutely.
Which there is absolutely no sign whatsoever.
No.
Yeah. In fact, less than 40 years ago, and that's something to reflect on. 40 years of shouting at people about how we want to hang trade.
Yes, exactly,
It's been a standard. I mean, it's going back a lot longer than that. Ted Budden was writing this sort of stuff in Combat, the newspaper of John Bean's British National Party, around 1962, 1963, how they all deserve to be hanged and so on, which philosophically I don't necessarily disagree with. But it was just raving, the powerless raving at the
Powerless raving, it's powerless raving.
Screaming at them. Well, we can scream at them as much as we want.
I think,
all the reins of power, we have nothing.
I mean, I'm just absolutely amazed by that gentleman who left. He seems to think that because he doesn't like Mandela, and Mandela, of course Mandela was a terrorist, there's no doubt about that, but he seems to think that therefore, because he doesn't like Mandela, therefore Mandela never did anything sensible from a political point of view.
Exactly,
It's not true. Even the worst and best people do sensible things, or make sensible or bad moves.
Since George Osborne has taken over the Standard, there's nothing about Brexit whatsoever that is good, not one thing, which makes the paper completely ludicrous, because there must be one thing that's good about Brexit, but you won't ever read it. It's so biased that it loses its.
Logic of this is saying Stalin gave the Soviet Union an extremely efficient national grid, which had never previously existed.
Yes.
Therefore, electric light is bad. It would be better to living in a hut with a window. Stalin did lots of bad things, but giving the Soviet Union an effective national grid was a good thing.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so he could be a very bad man and do some good things.
You can learn from your enemies, can't you?
Peter wanted to come in, and then you.
I just wanted to say that I don't actually remember the BNP ever advocating, hang them.
I didn't say they did. I never said that. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said you read people in social media and elsewhere saying this sort of thing. It's continuing in social media. It's all false names, all under false names, of course.
So you said a bit more than that. You implied that sort of nationalists, you know, for the last decades have been...
There's a coterie around it who certainly like to talk like that at these meetings. Yeah.
Young lady, you want to...
So when people usually get what's coming to them, don't they? You know, it's really easy to get, you know, angry and upset about what's going on. But people just get what's coming to them, so it's really important to just put out good things and not, you know, not to feel really
Sorry,
angry
Richard wants to come in.
If you try to be good,
All right, be quiet. I've got the floor. I've got the floor. The point I would like to make is the problem isn't the politicians. The problem is the British people
Well,
who
you
keep
can argue
voting
that,
for them in their millions.
yes.
That is the real problem.
Yes, but of course that all comes back to the politicians because they've been able to use their mechanisms to manipulate the lambs into voting for the wolves' dinner.
And with
Yes.
the media, of course.
With the media, yeah. I mean, the media is part of the system. I mean, the Evening Stand is not really a newspaper anymore in the sense of journalism. What it is advertising, and you get people to pick up the thing and see the advertising, which is where they get the money from, by sticking in a bit of bogus news or pale,
most
poor
people
news.
don't vote, though. I mean, there's a lot of people that don't vote.
No,
So
that's true.
there's more people that don't vote than do.
Yeah, well,
If you could tap into that, therein lies victory.
yeah.
I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. It's cold night, so we're going to get back. We'll probably arrange another one of these.